I have addressed this conclave for 112 years. I have stood at this lectern through 7 designations, 4 territorial disputes, and 2 extinction proceedings. I have outlasted 4 high conveners and watched the seating arrangements of this chamber rearranged 3 times as new species earned their place at the arc of recognized civilizations. In all of that time, I have never asked for the floor during an open session to oppose a junior delegate's motion. The business of governance flows through committees and sub-councils and working groups, and that is as it should be, the wisdom of many voices deliberating in chambers smaller than this one, so that this chamber is reserved for conclusions rather than arguments. I am asking for the floor today. The Paris Compact's 4th delegate, a young male of perhaps 60 standard years, has introduced motion 7714 epsilon, which calls for the reclassification of threshold designation 9 from absolutely restricted to navigable under survey mandate. The motion is, on its face, a procedural one. It carries 4 co-sponsors from 3 separate species blocks. It has been written carefully, with the language of scientific necessity and the vocabulary of progress. The delegate is clearly intelligent. His reasoning is internally consistent. He has cited resource surveys, navigational gap data, and a projected economic benefit to 7 member civilizations that I will not dispute, because the numbers themselves are not the problem. The problem is that the delegate is 60 years old. I am Sale of the Vale Korath, 41st elder of the line of remembrance, and I am 931 years old. I was born in the 8th century of the current reckoning, in the middle years of what the Conclave's own historical archives designate as the Long Settlement, the era of expansion, when civilization after civilization was pressing its borders outward, and the great cartographic guilds were still filling in the blank places at the edges of the known charts. I have seen species rise and fall. I have watched entire blocks of civilization negotiate their way into the Conclave's protection, and then negotiate themselves out of it through overconfidence and short memory. I have eaten at tables where elders sat who are not here anymore, and I have listened to their warnings, and I have carried those warnings forward through the decades like water in a sealed vessel, so that when a moment like this one arrives, I do not need to reach for documents. I carry the record in my bones. The 4th delegate of the Paris Compact will forgive me, I hope, if I do not address his economic projections. They are irrelevant, not because economics are irrelevant to governance. They are not, but because there is a prior question that his motion has not engaged, and that question is this: why does threshold designation 9 exist in the first place, and why has it held without a successful challenge for 4,216 years? That is not a rhetorical question. I am going to answer it. I ask only for the patience of this conclave. What I am about to set before you is not a single argument. It is a record, 3 records to be precise, from 3 different epochs, drawn from 3 different civilizations, one of them the Paris Compact's own predecessor culture, which the delegate may find instructive. I will present them in chronological order. I will present them plainly, without embellishment, because the records themselves require no embellishment. By the time I am finished, I believe the motion will be withdrawn. If I am wrong, and this conclave chooses to vote in favor of reclassification, I will accept that outcome. I am an elder of this body, not its sovereign, but I will have spoken. And when I am gone, I am 931, and I will not be here forever. The record I am about to deliver will remain in the archive of this session, and the next elder who is asked to stand and explain threshold designation 9 will have something to read into the chamber rather than having to carry it alone. That matters to me. I will begin. The first record comes from an era before the designation existed. Before there was a threshold designation 9, there was a survey mandate, the kind of mandate the 4th delegate's motion would reinstate, with broadly similar language, which is one of the reasons I am standing here today. 4,216 years ago, the civilization we now call the Ordathi, a spacefaring species that had been Conclave recognized for approximately 800 years at the time, and whose descendants are represented in this chamber today by the Ordathy Remnant Delegation, commissioned an exploratory survey of a region of space that their cartographers had flagged as an anomaly. The anomaly was not dramatic. I want to be clear about that, because there is a version of this history that makes the Ordathy sound foolish, and they were not foolish. The anomaly was a navigational peculiarity, a region of approximately 40 light-years in diameter in which stellar density was lower than surrounding sectors. Long-range sensor returns were inconsistent, and no previous survey fleet had penetrated beyond the outer boundary marker because no previous survey fleet had been asked to. The region was not flagged as dangerous. It was flagged as unexplored. The Ordathy, who were at that time a civilization of considerable scientific ambition and genuine accomplishment, they had, within the previous 3 centuries, developed the navigational relay architecture that a significant portion of the Conclave still relies upon today, decided to explore it. The survey fleet was designated the Ordathy Outer Reach Expedition, and it consisted of 7 vessels. These were not warships. They were science vessels, outfitted with the most advanced sensor arrays the Ordathy had developed, crewed by cartographers, biologists, atmospheric chemists, and navigational theorists. The crew complement across all 7 vessels totaled 89 beings. The mission mandate was a standard deep boundary survey. Proceed to the outer marker, map the interior of the anomalous region, document any stellar or planetary bodies of note, and return with charts. The expected duration was 14 standard months. The fleet departed on a date that the Ordathy calendar records and the Conclave's converted chronology places at 4,230 years ago. The first 8 months of the mission produced regular relay beacons on the standard schedule, positional data, preliminary sensor sweeps of the outer boundary regions, initial atmospheric readings from a gas giant companion body near the boundary's southern marker, and routine crew manifest notations. The beacons were received without interruption. The data was consistent with what the expedition's science teams had projected. There was nothing in those first 8 months of relay data to suggest that what followed would follow. 13 months and 22 days after departure, the flagship, a vessel called the Ardith Vor, which translates approximately as the patient surveyor, transmitted its final automated relay beacon from a position approximately 12 light-years inside the boundary of the anomalous region. The beacon contained the following: positional data, engine status logs, atmospheric composition readings from a planetary survey the Ardith Vor had been conducting for the previous 6 days, crew manifest notation confirming all 7 vessels still in company, a brief notation from the expedition's lead biologist regarding a spectrographic reading she wished to follow up on in the next survey phase, and a single line of standard navigational notation in the expedition log, entered by the fleet cartographer, which read: region interior consistent with outer boundary profile, survey proceeding, no anomalous contact, continuing inward. That is the last record from the fleet, not the last transmission, the last record. There were no distress signals. There were no anomalous readings on the relay beacon that followed. The beacon simply stopped. The Ardith Vor's next scheduled relay, 17 days later, never arrived. The relays from the 6 companion vessels, operating on staggered schedules as per standard survey protocol, also never arrived. 7 ships, 89 crew members, 14 months of accumulated survey data, and a cartographer's notation reading no anomalous contact, and then nothing. The Ordathy waited. Standard protocol for a lost survey fleet was to wait twice the projected mission duration before initiating a search expedition. They waited 28 months past the expedition's projected return date. No signals came. They organized a search expedition. 3 vessels, sent to the outer boundary of the anomalous region with orders to proceed cautiously, broadcast recall frequencies on all registered Ordathi survey channels, and document whatever they found. The search vessels were equipped with the same sensor arrays as the original expedition, supplemented by additional long-range passive receivers added specifically for this mission. The search expedition reached the outer boundary of the anomalous region and deployed their recall frequencies. They waited the prescribed interval, 40 standard days, and received no response from any of the 7 survey vessels. The region returned no navigational transponder signals. The relay frequencies came back empty. They did not proceed past the outer boundary. This is a detail I want to pause on because it is significant. The search expedition's commander, a female of the Ordathi senior navigator caste, whose name the archives record as Veth Oraz, filed a report upon the expedition's return that is still held in the Conclave's archive under historical designation, or 7719. I have read this report several times over the course of my service. The report is meticulous. Commander Veth Oraz was clearly a thorough person, careful with her language, precise in her characterizations. She did not dramatize. She wrote that upon reaching the outer boundary of the anomalous region and conducting the standard recall broadcast, her navigational instruments registered a return, not a signal return, but a sensor return from the interior of the region. A passive reading. Something was there, approximately 19 light-years inside the boundary, at a position that her calculations suggested was near the last known location of the Ardath Vor. The reading was consistent in profile with a powered vessel. Commander Veth Oraz did not proceed into the region to investigate. She noted in her report that the decision not to proceed was made after consultation with her senior officers, and that the basis for the decision was recorded in the ship's log as follows, and here I am characterizing from memory. The reading was consistent with a powered vessel, but the profile did not match any configuration in the Ordathi navigational registry. It was not the Ardath Vor. It was not any of the 6 companion vessels. It was not any vessel type the Ordathi had catalogued in 800 years of spacefaring and conclave membership. The profile was, in the commander's words, of a class and scale not previously catalogued, with propulsive characteristics outside the range of known stellar transit architectures. She came home, she filed her report. She recommended that the Ordathi Council of Survey formally close the Outer Reach expedition as a total loss, designate the anomalous region as restricted pending further investigation by a properly equipped military escort, and submit the sensor readings from the outer boundary to the Conclave's shared navigation registry as a caution flag, so that other civilizations navigating near the anomalous region's perimeter would have access to the data. The Ordathi Council of Survey accepted the first 2 recommendations and declined the third. They declined it because submitting the readings to the shared registry would have required disclosing the nature of the reading, the unregistered profile, the characteristics that fell outside known stellar transit architectures, and the Council determined that this information was sensitive pending the military investigation they intended to conduct. They intended, the records suggest, to conduct that investigation within the following decade and then submit corrected and contextualized findings to the Conclave. They did not conduct it within the following decade. The political circumstances of the Ordathi civilization in the subsequent century were complex. 3 successive administrations each placed the anomalous region investigation in the category of deferred priorities. The caution flag sat in the Ordathi navigational records as an internal notation. The anomalous region sat on the edges of their charts, marked simply as Survey Incomplete, Search Expedition Findings Inconclusive, Military Investigation Pending. It sat there for 114 years. I do not say this to criticize the Ordathi. Political circumstances compress priorities. The Ordathi civilization was managing genuine pressures during this period, and there was no visible consequence to the deferral. The anomalous region was quiet. It made no demands. Commander Veth Oraz's sensor reading of an unregistered profile sat in the archive unexamined, and no further incidents occurred to compel examination. And so examination was deferred, year by year, as it so often is when the thing being deferred does not press for attention. 114 years after the loss of the Ardath Vor, the Ordathi organized what they called not a survey expedition, and not a search expedition but an assessment mission. The political climate had shifted decisively toward expansion. A new administration had come to power with an explicit mandate to develop the outer boundary regions of Ordatha-chartered space, and the anomalous region was on the charts. It was large. It potentially contained habitable planets. The pending military investigation had by this point been deferred across 6 administrations, and had never been formally closed. The new administration closed it by incorporating it into the assessment mission's mandate. The assessment fleet consisted of 12 vessels, 4 science vessels carrying the updated sensor suite developed in the intervening century, and 8 military escort ships of the Ordathi Frontier Patrol configuration. The total crew complement was 411 beings. The fleet was commanded by a senior officer of the Ordathi expansionist fleet, whose name the Conclave's records from this period do not preserve with certainty. The Ordathi archives from the middle of this era have significant gaps, for reasons I will come to, but who was understood to be among the most experienced commanders in the Ordathi service. The mission profile called for penetration to a depth of 15 light-years past the outer boundary, a full sensor sweep of the penetrated region, survey of any planetary bodies encountered, and a return within 18 standard months, with the option to extend by 6 months if survey conditions warranted. The assessment fleet departed on a date the current chronology places at 4,102 years ago. The first relay beacon arrived from inside the boundary at the scheduled interval, 12 days after departure, confirming the fleet's position at 3 light-years past the outer marker. All vessels in company, initial sensor sweep of the immediate interior underway, no anomalous readings. The beacon was routine. The mission, at that point, appeared to be proceeding as planned. The second relay beacon, scheduled for 24 days after departure, did not arrive. The Ordathi mission control waited. Relay beacons could be delayed by interference conditions. This was well understood, and the anomalous region's interior had documented interference characteristics. They waited 2 beacon intervals, then 3. No beacon arrived from any of the 12 vessels. The mission control notified the Council of Survey. The Council of Survey convened. 48 months passed from the fleet's departure date with no signal received. The Conclave was notified at this point, not because the Ordathi wanted to notify the Conclave, I should be clear, but because 3 other civilizations whose navigational lanes passed near the outer boundary of the anomalous region had independently noticed the cessation of Ordathi navigational transponder traffic in that sector, and had begun asking questions through their own diplomatic channels. The Conclave convened a joint inquiry. The Ordathi representatives disclosed, for the first time to the full body, the complete history of the region. The original survey expedition, its loss, Commander Veth Oraz's search mission, her sensor reading of the unregistered profile, the 114-year gap, and the assessment mission that had now been gone for 4 years without a single relay beacon. The Conclave's joint inquiry included, for the first time, a full examination of Commander Veth Oraz's sensor readings. Those readings had been sitting in the Ordathi Navigational Archive for 118 years. The Conclave's own technical teams, drawn from 14 member civilizations, the most comprehensive panel the Conclave had assembled for a technical review at that point in its history, spent 11 standard months analyzing them. Their conclusion was formal, and it is preserved in the founding documentation of Threshold Designation 9. I will not reproduce the technical language here. The substance was this: the profile that Commander Veth Oraz recorded at the outer boundary of the anomalous region 118 years before the Conclave's inquiry. The profile she had described as of a class and scale not previously catalogued, with propulsive characteristics outside the range of known stellar transit architectures, was consistent, by the technical team's analysis, with a vessel of construction type and propulsive signature that did not appear in any navigational registry of any civilization then known to the Conclave. This included all historical registries, all records of pre-Conclave spacefaring civilizations, and all catalogued ruins and debris fields from species that had achieved space transit before the current era of recognized governance. It was not Ordathy. It was not of any member species. It was not of any species the Conclave had ever catalogued. It was not of any species for which the Conclave had a record of prior existence. And the technical team's geological interference analysis, cross-referencing the sensor profile's interaction with the local stellar environment against established models of how different propulsion architectures interact with deep space particulate fields over time, concluded with careful and formal reluctance that the profile was not consistent with a vessel that had been present in that location for months or years or centuries. The lower bound on the technical team's estimated duration of presence was not a number that appeared often in the Conclave's records up to that point. I will not state the number in this open session. It is in the sealed record, and the seal is appropriate. The Conclave issued Threshold Designation 9 4,216 years ago. The language of the original designation is still the language in force today. Absolutely restricted, no survey mandate, no military incursion, no navigational transit, no communication attempt, no probe deployment within the outer boundary marker. The Ordathy assessment fleet of 12 vessels and 411 crew has never been accounted for. The Ordathy civilization, as I noted, collapsed 87 years after the designation was issued. The collapse was due to causes unrelated to the threshold: internal conflict, resource failures, the accumulated weight of pressures that had been building for a century. Whether the loss of the assessment fleet contributed, in some indirect way, to the political conditions that produced the collapse is a question historians have debated, and which I will not enter into here. What is established is that the Ordathy archives from the period between the fleet's departure and the civilization's collapse are incomplete, and that the Conclave's inquiry was drawing on a partial documentary record even at the time of the original designation. The Ordathy remnant, this Conclave's current member, carries a population of perhaps a tenth of what the Ordathy civilization sustained at its height. They are represented in this chamber today. I see their delegation. I would ask them to note, if they are willing, that the record I have just described is their record and that I have not distorted it. That is the first record. I will give the Conclave a moment to settle before I proceed to the second. 2009 years ago, approximately 2,200 years after the issuance of Threshold Designation 9, and approximately 1,000 years into the current reckoning, a coalition of civilizations operating under the trade governance structure known as the Verath Conquered brought a formal challenge to the Conclave. The Verath Conquered was, at that time, the most economically powerful bloc in the recognized galaxy. They controlled approximately a third of navigational corridor licensing, 2 of the 5 great cartographic guilds, and the majority of deep-range transit infrastructure in the middle sectors. They were sophisticated, well-organized, and confident in their sophistication. Confidence they had earned, I should note, through genuine achievement. The Verath Conquered had built something remarkable in their 3 centuries of recognized governance, a trading network that had lifted 12 member civilizations out of resource scarcity and created the conditions for a period of relative peace across a wide arc of inhabited space. They were not arrogant in the way that lesser achievements sometimes produce arrogance. They were confident in the way that real competence sometimes produces confidence, and that is a subtler thing, and in some ways a more dangerous one, because it is harder to argue with. They were also, by the standards of the designation's age, newcomers. The Varath conquered had been a conclave-recognized governance structure for only 300 years at the point of their challenge, which means that the civilizations comprising it had no institutional memory of the period in which the designation had been established. For them, the designation was not a living record. It was a historical artifact, ancient and largely unexamined, maintained by convention rather than by continuing understanding of what it marked. Their challenge was not procedurally dissimilar to the motion introduced today by the fourth delegate of the Parisy Compact. The Varath conquered argued that Threshold Designation 9 was based on findings now more than 2,000 years old, that the original inquiry's technical conclusions should be re-examined with modern analytical tools that were, by the standards of the current era, vastly superior to those available to the founding panel, that the unexplored region within the designation represented a navigational gap of significant economic consequence to civilizations in 3 sectors, and that a properly structured, carefully limited, instrument-only survey mission, no inhabited vessels, no military presence, could resolve the outstanding questions without meaningful risk and with potentially substantial benefit. The conclave of that era debated the challenge at length. I was not yet born, I am old, but I am not 2,000 years old. The records of those debates are in the archive. What I know from my own reading of those records is that the debate was substantial and serious. The Varath conquered made its case well. There were elder delegates of that era who found merit in the challenge, who believed that the technological gap between the founding panel's instruments and those available 2 millennia later was significant enough to warrant revisitation. The debate lasted 11 months. At the end of it, the conclave of that era did not grant the Varath conquered's challenge. They reaffirmed the designation by a margin of votes that the records describe as substantial but not unanimous. The conquered's delegates accepted the reaffirmation with formal civility and returned to their governance structure. 6 years later, the Varath conquered sent 12 warships into the designation independently. I want to be precise about this, because the historical record has occasionally been imprecise, and because the conquered's own archive, which the conclave obtained access to in the aftermath of what followed, provides a detailed picture of the decision-making process that led to the incursion. The decision was not impulsive. It was planned over a period of approximately 2 years following the reaffirmation. The conquered did not send a survey mission in defiance of the conclave's ruling. They commissioned what their internal records describe as a defensive assessment operation, framed on the grounds that the conquered had a legitimate security interest in understanding the nature of a restricted region that bordered navigational lanes used by conquered member civilizations, and that the conclave's reaffirmation did not constitute a legal prohibition on such an assessment. This legal interpretation was, in the subsequent review, found to be without merit, but the point is that the conquered's leadership believed it at the time, or believed it sufficiently to act on it. They were not lawless actors making a reckless decision. They were confident actors making a calculated one. 12 warships, full military complement, with orders to penetrate the designation to a depth of 10 light-years, conduct a comprehensive sensor sweep using instrumentation that was, by that era's standards, genuinely superior to anything the founding panel had used, and withdraw. The operation was approved at the highest level of the conquered's governance structure. It was funded through a discretionary military account that was later audited and confirmed to have been specifically established for this purpose. It was not disclosed to the conclave in advance. The 12 warships departed from a staging point near the outer boundary of the designation, on a date the current chronology places at 2003 years ago. The Conclave's own monitoring infrastructure at that time, border watchers maintained along the outer boundary of the designation, as a standard condition of the original threshold protocol, a small complement of observation vessels that had been continuously stationed there for over 2,000 years, registered the departure of the 12 warships into the restricted region. The border watchers filed their reports through standard channels. The Conclave convened an emergency session to address the unauthorized incursion. While that session was still in progress, approximately 4 hours after convening, the border watchers filed a second report. I asked the Conclave to attend to this carefully. The border watchers' second report, filed 22 standard hours after the 12 warships had crossed the outer boundary, contained passive sensor readings from the boundary itself. Not from inside the boundary. The border watchers had standing orders not to enter, and they held those orders, but from the boundary's outer edge, where their monitoring equipment was capable of passively recording what occurred on the other side to the extent that signals carried that far. In those 22 hours, the border watchers recorded the following sequence of events. First, the navigational transponder signals of all 12 warships ceased within 4 hours of the crossing. The cessations were staggered, the first occurring at 2 hours and 17 minutes, the last at 3 hours and 51 minutes. The cessation pattern was consistent with the vessels moving deeper into the region, beyond the range at which their transponders could be reliably received at the boundary, given the designation's documented interference characteristics. This was noted and logged as expected behavior. The border watcher's watch commander noted in her real-time log that the cessation pattern fell within normal parameters for that depth and transit speed, and that she was monitoring. At 8 hours and 40 minutes after the crossing, the border watcher's passive sensors registered the first anomalous reading. It was brief, lasting approximately 4 minutes, and its profile was not consistent with any of the 12 warships. The watch commander flagged it and continued monitoring. At 13 hours and 22 minutes after the crossing, a second anomalous reading, different profile from the first, considerably larger by amplitude, lasting 11 minutes. The watch commander notified the Conclave's emergency session in real time. At 17 hours and 8 minutes after the crossing, the border watcher's passive sensors registered a third anomalous reading, not from the 12 warships. The profile was not consistent with any registered Conclave vessel type. It was not Ordathian profile. The Ordathi profile from Commander Veth Oraz's records was on file and was immediately compared against it. It was not that profile. It was a different configuration, and considerably larger by the sensor reading's amplitude than the Ordathi profile Commander Veth Oraz had recorded. It was inside the designation, at a position the border watcher's instruments estimated as approximately 8 light-years from the outer boundary, somewhat closer to the boundary than the 12 warships should have been able to reach in 17 hours at their stated transit speed. The third anomalous reading lasted 11 minutes, then it ceased. At 22 hours and 14 minutes after the crossing, the border watchers registered a fourth reading. Same general direction as the third, different profile, smaller and different in configuration. Moving toward the outer boundary at a rate the watch commander described in her log as steady and consistent, not accelerating, not decelerating, as though the destination were already known. The border watchers filed their report and held position. The Conclave session received the report in real time. There was significant debate about whether the border watchers should advance to the outer boundary in a monitoring capacity, and some pressure from delegates who argued that if one of the 12 warships was returning, it might need assistance. The decision reached, and I will say that the high convener of that era made the correct call, was that the border watchers should hold their position and observe, but should not advance. At 22 hours and 51 minutes after the original crossing, a single vessel emerged from the outer boundary of the designation. It was not one of the 12 Varath-conquered warships. The profile did not match any registered vessel in the Conclave's navigational registry in any era's records. The vessel was heavily damaged. This was apparent from the sensor readings before visual confirmation was possible. Its propulsion systems were producing a signature consistent with severe structural compromise across multiple sections. It was maintaining minimal navigational control, enough to hold a vector, not enough to respond to external direction. It continued on a ballistic course away from the boundary, decelerating slowly under what remained of its own drive system, until it came to rest approximately 30 light minutes from the outer edge. The border watchers attempted communication on all standard frequencies, all emergency channels, all frequencies that any member civilization had used for any purpose in the prior 5 centuries. The vessel did not respond on any registered channel. The watch commander tried frequencies from the Ordathi historical registry, on the grounds that if the vessel was as old as its profile suggested, it might be using an older communication standard. Nothing. The border watchers approached under full emergency protocol and achieved docking contact after 3 hours of careful work. The vessel's external docking interfaces were not in a configuration any of the border watchers had encountered before, and the docking had to be improvised. What they found aboard that vessel I am not going to describe in complete detail in this open session. The Conclave's own archive contains the border watchers' full documentation under seal, and I have neither the authority nor the desire to unseal it here. What I will describe is the portion that appears in the non-sealed historical précis available to any member civilization. The vessel was not of any construction type or material composition catalogued in the Conclave's records at any point in its history. The border watchers' preliminary material analysis, conducted with the instruments they carried, which were the standard monitoring equipment of that era, produced readings that the watch commander described in her log as inconsistent with any fabricated material in the current database and inconsistent with natural geological formation. The vessel's construction material was not metal in any alloy configuration the instruments recognized. It was not ceramic. It was not a polymer or composite. It was something that did not produce a clean match in the material registry, which meant it was either an extremely unusual natural material fashioned into structural shapes, or a fabricated material outside the instrument's cataloged range. Subsequent analysis by the Conclave's best technical teams, using far superior instrumentation, confirmed the latter. It was fabricated. The fabrication process was not one any Conclave member civilization had used, or had the capacity to use, or could fully reverse engineer from examination of the resulting material. The Conclave's technical teams published a summary of their analysis, not the full findings, which are sealed, describing the material as of non-member origin, fabrication process undetermined, structural properties outside standard material science parameters. The vessel contained evidence of recent occupancy, physical traces consistent with biological presence, environmental systems that had been recently active, navigational interfaces that had recently received input. There were no living occupants, no bodies, no biological remains of any kind. Whatever had been aboard this vessel at the moment of its last use was not present when the border watchers entered it. There was, on what the border watchers assessed as the vessel's primary navigational interface, the main control surface at the front of the vessel's apparent command compartment, a mark. The mark was not in any registered script or symbolic system in the Conclave's archive. It had been made with a material that the technical analysis subsequently determined was not ink or any analogous substance, but rather a modification of the interface surface itself. The material of the surface had been changed at a molecular level to produce the mark. The modification was recent, in the technical team's assessment, within weeks of the vessel's emergence from the designation. The mark was 3 characters, or 3 shapes, arranged in a sequence the technical teams interpreted as linear, left to right, as it were, though this interpretation carries assumptions about directionality that may not apply. The border watchers documented it carefully. The Conclave's technical teams analyzed it for the better part of a decade. Linguists, semioticians, xenocommunication specialists from 9 member civilizations were engaged in the analysis over the years that followed. The conclusion, maintained to this day, is that the mark is not a language or script system the Conclave has encountered before or since. It could be 3 characters of a writing system. It could be 3 symbols in a notational system with no linguistic component. It could be something that has no analog in any communication framework any member civilization uses. It has not been deciphered, and it has not been for want of effort. What the technical teams could determine from the vessel's navigational logs, which were partially intact and partially recoverable through methods I need not describe here, was where the vessel had come from. The logs showed it had traveled from inside the designation to the outer boundary. The recoverable sections contained navigational references, positions, bearings, vectors that described a route from somewhere considerably deep inside the designation to the position at which the border watchers had found it, drifting. The technical team's assessment of the journey time implicit in the navigational log was approximately 19 hours. 19 hours from somewhere deep inside the designation to the outer boundary. The vessel had emerged 22 hours and 51 minutes after 12 Verath-conquered warships had crossed into the region. The Verath-conquered filed a formal inquiry with the Conclave regarding the fate of their 12 warships. The Conclave responded by providing the conquered with the border watchers' full documentation, the vessel's preliminary analysis, and the technical team's findings as they developed over the subsequent years. 2 years after the incident, the Verath-conquered Senior Governance Council issued a formal statement acknowledging that the 12 warships were to be considered lost, that the conquered accepted full responsibility for the unauthorized incursion into a protected designation, that the incursion had been conducted without proper legal authorization under the Conclave's governance framework, and that the conquered would not challenge Threshold Designation 9 again. The statement was signed by the conquered's entire governance council and submitted for inclusion in the Conclave's permanent record. It has been in the archive for 2001 years. The vessel that emerged from the designation was placed in secure containment at a facility I will not name in open session. It remains there. The 3-character mark on its navigational interface has not been deciphered in the 2001 years since the border watchers first documented it. Efforts to decipher it have not been abandoned. The Conclave's Xenocommunication Archive maintains an active research file on the mark, updated as new analytical methods become available. The research file has produced no successful decipherment. The vessel remains intact, in good physical condition apart from the damage visible upon emergence, at a facility maintained under Conclave jurisdiction. The Conclave's current technical teams, the most sophisticated the recognized galaxy has ever assembled, working with instruments of a capability that would have been considered impossible in the era of the designation's founding, have examined the vessel's construction material, its navigational systems, its environmental systems, and its propulsion architecture. Their most recent formal assessment, issued 31 years ago and updated with supplemental findings 12 years ago, concluded that the vessel's construction is consistent with a technological tradition that is not represented in any Conclave record of any era, and that the level of understanding required to construct it exceeds what can be reverse engineered from examination alone. I will state plainly what that assessment means. We have had this vessel for 2,000 years. We cannot figure out how it was made. That is the second record. I am aware that the conclave has been sitting for some time. I will ask for continued patience. The third record is the shortest, and it is the one I suspect the fourth delegate of the Paris Compact will find most directly relevant to his motion. 51 years ago, the civilization that preceded the current Paris Compact. I will refer to it by the name its own historical records use. The Paris Assembly constructed what its scientific council described, informal publications available in the conclave's shared academic registry, as the most sophisticated unmanned deep space probe in the history of the recognized galaxy. The description was not an exaggeration. I am familiar with the probe. I was alive when it was built. The Vale Korath maintained close relationships with the other elder species of the conclave, and the Paris Assembly's deep space research program was well known and widely respected. The probe's development had been a 30-year project, incorporating sensor technologies pooled from 11 different member civilizations under a research consortium specifically established for this purpose. Its propulsive architecture allowed sustained transit velocities that were, at the time of its construction, unmatched by any equivalent unmanned platform in the conclave's operational inventory. Its communication architecture, and this is relevant, was specifically designed to maintain reliable contact through interference environments that previous probe designs had found impractical. The Paris Assembly's engineers had studied every documented interference environment in the conclave's navigational records and had built a communication system robust enough to function in all of them. I read the technical specifications when they were published. I remember thinking that the communication architecture was, in particular, a genuine achievement. The Paris Assembly's engineers had solved problems that teams from 4 other civilizations had been working on for decades. The probe was, in every measurable sense, the finest instrument of its kind. The Assembly's stated purpose for the probe was broad-spectrum deep space survey. It was intended to operate in the outer regions of Paris-chartered space for an indefinite mission duration, cataloging stellar bodies, refining navigational charts, testing the communication architecture under operational conditions, and serving as a demonstration platform for the pooled technologies that had gone into its construction. This was, and I say this without any suggestion of deception on the Assembly's part, a description that was accurate in all its particulars, and which, as subsequent disclosure confirmed, omitted one particular. The probe's planned route, in its third operational phase, took it to the outer boundary of threshold designation 9. The Assembly did not seek the conclave's permission for the boundary pass. The designation's language prohibits entry into the restricted region. The Assembly's legal interpretation, disclosed subsequently, not in advance, was that a passive sensor pass along the outer boundary, without crossing the boundary itself, was not prohibited by the designation's language. This interpretation was arguable in a narrow technical sense, and the conclave's legal committee has since concluded that it was incorrect. But it was not a frivolous interpretation. The Assembly's legal team had constructed a reasonable case. The probe reached the outer boundary of the designation 43 years ago, after 8 years of transit and preliminary operations in the outer survey regions. The third operational phase commenced according to plan. For the first 11 days of the boundary pass, the probe transmitted continuous telemetry, sensor sweeps of the designation's outer boundary profile with a resolution and precision that had never been achieved before, navigational data, atmospheric and particle field readings from the boundary environment, and regular system status reports confirming the probe's instrumentation was functioning within specified parameters. The Assembly's science teams were analyzing the data in real time. They published a preliminary summary in the conclave's shared academic registry. This is available to any member civilization today, describing the outer boundary profile of the designation with unprecedented precision. The summary was widely read. It was the finest scientific documentation of the designation's outer characteristics ever produced. Several research teams across the conclave incorporated its findings into ongoing work in related fields. On the 12th day, the probe's transmission pattern changed. I want the conclave to understand this with precision, because the change was subtle in its initial form, and the Assembly's mission control team spent several hours determining whether what they were observing was real. The probe's communication architecture, designed specifically to maintain robust contact through interference environments, began producing a transmission pattern that mission control initially classified as a data formatting anomaly. The signal itself was intact. The probe was transmitting on its standard frequencies, at its standard power levels, in its standard rhythmic pulse pattern. The communication link was functioning exactly as designed, but the content of the transmission had changed in a way that the Assembly's teams in their first assessment could not account for. The probe was transmitting data that its sensor suite had not been programmed to produce. This needs to be understood carefully. The probe's sensor suite was comprehensive and well documented. The teams at Mission Control knew exactly what each instrument was capable of producing, in what format, on what channel. They had received 11 days of data from those instruments, and they knew their signatures. What they were now receiving, alongside the instrument's normal output, was additional data, structured, formatted data, using the probe's own communication protocols, readable by the probe's own transmission standards, but not generated by any instrument aboard the probe. Something was adding data to the probe's telemetry stream. Something that understood the probe's communication protocol, not in a superficial way, not in a way that produced garbled or malformed content that could be distinguished from legitimate probe output. Something that understood the protocol thoroughly enough to inject additional content into the standard transmission channels in a way that was correctly formatted, that rode the correct frequencies, and that was internally organized rather than random. The Assembly science teams spent 16 hours attempting to determine whether this was an internal probe malfunction, data corruption of a sophisticated kind, a memory system error generating spurious output, software degradation producing structured noise. They ruled out all of these explanations. The injected content was too well formed for corruption. It was using the probe's own data standards correctly. In some cases, the technical teams noted, using aspects of the probe's data format that the probe itself had not yet used in its own output, aspects that were present in the probe's design specifications, but which had not yet been triggered by any of the survey operations the probe had conducted. Something was using the probe's own unpublished design specifications. The design specifications that existed in documents that had never left the Paris Assembly's mission control facility. The Assembly's science teams did not make a public statement at this point. They suspended publication of real-time telemetry summaries, locked the mission data to a controlled access group, and began an internal review. The conclave was notified under the standard border proximity reporting protocol. The probe's boundary pass had triggered automatic notifications, and the conclave's technical observers joined the review. Over the following 47 days, the probe continued to transmit. The injected data stream continued alongside the probe's own sensor output, consistent in volume and in the quality of its formatting. The Assembly's teams and the conclave's technical observers worked in parallel and in collaboration to analyze the injected content. I will not characterize the full content of the injected data. The analysis is under archive seal, and that seal exists for good reason, and I will respect it. But I have read the sealed analysis. I was part of the conclave's oversight panel for the closed inquiry that reviewed it, and I will say what I have authority to say, which is what the non-sealed historical précis accurately reflects. The injected data was coherent, internally organized, referential in structure, meaning that later portions of the data referred back to earlier portions in ways that suggested the content was not arbitrary but was building on itself, accumulating towards something. The technical teams from the Assembly and the Conclave's observers agreed on this characterization after extensive parallel analysis, and their agreement was significant because they had not agreed on several preliminary questions. The injected data appeared to contain three categories of content. First, navigational information, positions and coordinates that the technical teams could cross-reference against known spatial references. Some of those positions were inside the designation. Some were outside it, in regions of space that the Conclave currently navigates and inhabits. Some were in regions that were, at the time of the analysis, marked on navigational charts as uninhabited deep space. The teams did not know, in some cases, whether those regions actually were uninhabited or whether the charts were simply incomplete. Second, temporal references, not in any calendar system used by any member civilization, but referential sequences that appeared to be temporal in nature, sequences that ordered events, that placed things in relation to each other in time. Some of those temporal sequences, when aligned with the navigational positions that accompanied them, produced patterns that the technical teams recognized. Patterns that corresponded to events in the Conclave's own historical record. Events that the injected data appeared, by the team's analysis, to have knowledge of. Events that had occurred before the probe was built. Third, temporal sequences that extended past the date of the analysis. I want to be as careful here as the record requires. The technical teams characterized their finding with appropriate uncertainty. They were not certain that what they were interpreting as future-directed temporal references was what it appeared to be. The analytical methods they were using to interpret an entirely unfamiliar data structure had significant margins of error. They could not rule out alternative interpretations of the sequences in question. What they could say, and what they did say, in the language that appeared in the closed inquiries report, and that I was present to read, was that a portion of the injected content was structured in a way that was consistent with references to events that had not yet occurred at the time of the analysis, and that this characterization could not be confidently dismissed. On the 48th day, the probe stopped transmitting. Not a gradual cessation, not a signal degradation consistent with propulsion failure or power system failure or instrumentation damage accumulating over time. The transmission simply ceased between one standard pulse and the next, with no transition and no decay signature. The Assembly's mission control confirmed within 6 hours that the cessation was not a receiver problem at their end. Every receiving station in the Conclave's relay network confirmed the same. The probe's final positional fix placed it at the outer boundary of the designation. The probe had not, at any point during the 47-day transmission period, crossed into the restricted region. The boundary pass had been conducted outside the boundary. A recovery mission was commissioned jointly by the Assembly and the Conclave. The mission reached the probe's last known position 7 months later, equipped with the most sensitive detection instruments available and a mandate to conduct a thorough search. There was no probe. There was no debris, no structural fragment, no material remnant, no trace of the probe's physical presence, not a shard of its construction material, not a residual propulsion exhaust trace, not a single component of its 11 civilizations' combined instrumentation. The recovery mission conducted an extended search of the surrounding volume, expanding outward from the last known position in systematic sweeps. Nothing was found. One of the most sophisticated unmanned platforms ever assembled had ceased to transmit and had ceased to exist in the same moment, at a position outside the restricted region's boundary, without leaving any physical trace. The Conclave convened a closed inquiry. I attended that inquiry. I served on its oversight panel for the full 3 years of its duration. The conclusions are under archive seal, and I will respect that seal. But I was in the room when the conclusions were reached. I sat with the technical teams and the legal committee and the governance council representatives and the senior archivists when the final report was complete and the last signature was placed. And when it was done, no one in that room spoke for a long time. We sat with what we had concluded. And then the high convener of that time, an elder of the Solvath species whom I had known for 60 years, a being not given to dramatic expression, a being who had governed through difficult situations with a quality of steadiness I had always admired, said something I have remembered for 51 years. I will not reproduce it here because it was said in a private session and it was not meant for the open archive. But it was, in essence, an acknowledgement that we had been told something. That whatever was inside the designation had used our finest instrument to tell us something, and had then declined to continue the conversation, and had taken the instrument with it, and that we were now in the position of having been spoken to in a language we could only partially interpret by an entity we could not locate or describe. The Parisy Assembly became the Parisy Compact 12 years later, following a restructuring that the Compact's own historians have documented. The institutional memory of what the probe found and what happened to the probe exists in the Compact's archive, alongside the Conclave's sealed inquiry record. The fourth delegate has access to the non-sealed portions of that archive, and I would suggest that before this session adjourned, he take the time to read them. That is the third record. I want to say something now that is not a record. It is an observation from 931 years of service in this and related bodies, and it is the closest thing to a personal statement I will offer this conclave today. In that time, I have encountered many arguments for revisiting established prohibitions. Most of those arguments are made in good faith. Most of them are made by capable beings who have examined the available record and found it genuinely ambiguous from where they stand. I do not doubt the fourth delegate's sincerity. I do not doubt the economic analysis supporting the motion. I do not doubt that, at 60 years old, the delegate has read what is available to him and reached a reasonable conclusion from it. What I know that the delegate cannot know at 60 years old is that the available record is not the full record. The full record is sealed. It was sealed incrementally, across 4 millennia, by successive conclave inquiries that each examined the findings of the previous one and added to them, and that each concluded, separately, across thousands of years of institutional distance, that full disclosure in open archive would not serve the well-being of member civilizations who did not need to carry the weight of the complete findings. The seal is not a conspiracy. It is a considered decision, revisited and reaffirmed at each inquiry, about what it is useful for the broader conclave membership to know versus what it is sufficient for the governing body to carry. I have read the full record. I carry it, as elders of the line of remembrance are asked to carry it. I will not characterize it beyond what I have already said, because the seal is appropriate and I will honor it, but I will say this. The full record is consistent with everything in the portion of the record I have presented today. It is consistent, and in some respects it extends further than what I have described, and in those further respects it is why the seal was placed where it was. What is inside threshold designation 9 is not hostile in the way that word is usually used in this chamber, in the way it is used to describe a species that attacks border stations, or an empire that demands tribute, or a civilization that poisons navigational lanes. What is inside the designation does not appear to require anything from us. It does not appear to need our resources, our territory, our navigation, or our acknowledgement. It has not, in 4,216 years, attempted to expand past the boundary of the region the designation marks. It has not communicated with the conclave directly. in any format we have recognized as such. It has not done anything that could be described as threatening in the conventional sense. What it has done each time we have approached is respond, not with words, not with weapons, with outcomes. 3 civilizations approached the Ordathy, the Varath conquered, the Parisi assembly with the best tools they had available, with intentions that ranged from scientific survey to military assessment to instrument-only passive observation. And each time something was demonstrated, not the same demonstration each time. The demonstrations were different in character, as though calibrated. That word troubles me, but it is the word the inquiry reports use, as though calibrated to the nature of the approach. The Ordathy sent a survey fleet. The fleet did not return, and what was at the last known position of the fleet was something that had no registry entry and had been there, by the evidence, for longer than survey fleets had existed. The Varath conquered sent warships. The warships did not return, and what emerged from the designation was a vessel that had been made by a technology we cannot replicate after 2,000 years of study, bearing a mark we cannot read, arriving 19 hours after 12 warships went in. The Parisi assembly sent a probe designed to listen. The probe was given 47 days of organized, structured, carefully formatted data, using the probe's own unpublished specifications as a framework data that included what appeared to be references to events the probe could not have known about from its own instruments. And then the probe ceased to exist. Survey fleet, warships, probe designed to listen. The response in each case was appropriate to the nature of the approach. That is the word I keep returning to, appropriate. I am not saying this means we should be afraid. Fear is not the appropriate register, and it has not been, in my view, the appropriate register since before I joined this body. What I am saying is that what is in the designation understands us, has understood us or something about us, for long enough that the concept of it learning to understand us, in the way we learn to understand each other, may not apply. It may have understood us before we were here to be understood. And it is patient. This is the thing I have sat with for a century of service. It is patient in a way that makes the 4,000 years of the designation's history look like a brief exchange. It has not pressed on the boundary. It has not followed any of the incursions outward. When our instruments stopped at the outer edge, it did not pursue them. It demonstrated what it demonstrated, and then it went back to whatever it does when we are not approaching, and it has waited, and we have not approached again, and it has continued to wait. The designation is not a prohibition against curiosity. I want to be clear about this, because I'm not standing here to argue against curiosity. Curiosity built the Ordathy relay architecture that this conclave still uses. Curiosity built the Varath conquered's navigational corridor network. Curiosity built the Parisi assembly's probe. Curiosity is among the most valuable things a spacefaring civilization can maintain. I am not against it. What the designation is, what it has always been, since the founding panel inscribed it 4,216 years ago, is the notation that remains after curiosity has been satisfied. The Ordathy were curious about the anomalous region. They sent a survey fleet, and they found out what was there, and the answer was not in the form of a chart or a catalog of stellar bodies. The Varath conquered was curious whether the designation was still necessary. They sent warships, and they found out, and the answer came back in the form of a vessel that neither they nor we have been able to fully understand in 2,000 years of study. The Parisi assembly was curious what passive instruments at the boundary would detect. They sent the finest passive instrument ever made, and they found out, and the answer came back in 47 days of injected data that referenced events the probe had no access to, and then the instrument ceased to exist. We know what is there. We have known, in the way that knowing is possible about a thing that does not explain itself and does not need to, for a very long time. The fourth delegate introduced motion 7714 epsilon in good faith. I have no doubt of that. His civilization's predecessor sent a probe into the outer boundary in good faith, for reasons that made sense within the scope of what they knew. Good faith has not, historically, been the variable that determined outcomes in relation to threshold designation 9. I am going to sit down. I have presented the record, and the record is available for the conclave to weigh. If the motion proceeds to a vote, I will vote against it, as is my right and my obligation under the designation standing protocols. I have done so twice before in my tenure on this body, and I have explained my vote each time, and I am prepared to do so again if it becomes necessary. I do not believe it will become necessary. I say this not out of any confidence in my persuasiveness. I am old enough to have been persuasive when I was wrong and unpersuasive when I was right, and I have learned to hold the distinction without vanity in either direction. I say it because in 931 years I have watched what happens when capable beings of good intelligence encounter the record I have just described, laid out plainly, without argument or embellishment. I have watched it 3 times from this lectern, and twice in closed inquiry, and once in a context I will not describe here. The record is what it is. It does not require advocacy once it is understood. The Ordathi sent a survey fleet. They would not do that again. The Verath conquered, challenged the designation, and sent 12 warships. They would not do that again. The Parisi Assembly sent the finest instrument the galaxy had assembled. They would not do that again. None of them had to be told twice. That is the nature of the record. Threshold designation 9 was established 4,216 years ago. It has held. It will hold today. The session may continue as it will. I am finished.